Appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate you. So welcome everyone to our March Grand Rounds or Ability Grand Rounds for the West Virginia University Center for Excellence in Disabilities. My name is Nesley Cottrell, and I have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for this month. Cortland Nesley is the program manager in the Traumatic Brain Injury Program here at the WVU CED. And little birdie had talked to me the other day or many months ago that Cortland had given this presentation to another group, and it was wonderfully received, and the information was hugely helpful. So Cortland has agreed to share this information with a larger group, with the center level and our partners today. Before he gets started, please remember some Zoom etiquette, mute your line, and just know that we're going to give some space, hopefully, for questions at the end of this hour, in case you have questions, but feel free to use the chat as well. So with that, Cortland, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. What we are going to be talking today, as you can see on this lovely screen share thing, is this is an introduction to neurodiversity. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about what that is, because some of you, I imagine, might be unfamiliar with that or have some vague idea of what it is. We're going to talk about what the neurodiversity movement is, how it sort of contrasts to other conceptions of disability that we see in the medical field and the social services field, and how we can take neurodiversity principles and apply it to what we do as people who work, in the field of disabilities here. In addition to Leslie's lovely introduction, I'll also add one of the pronouns are he, him, his, and also I am autistic. I'm proudly autistic, and that sort of colors a lot of my understanding of neurodiversity and of disability more generally. And I'm excited to sort of leverage that lived experience in a way that will hopefully provide some insights in ways that hopefully we can create a dialogue and it will be helpful. And I do mean a dialogue, so fair warning to y'all. I like to be interactive with such things, so I might be coming to you and asking you some questions over the course of this. I can see the chat, so if you want to vocalize in your response, that's great. If you prefer to use the chat, that is fine also. Now, before there we go. Before we dig into the sort of like meat of the matter, there are some content warnings I wanted to provide. You never know sort of if an audience has a particular trigger somebody in the audience has. So I just wanted to sort of give some forewarning because we will be touching on some sensitive subjects over the course of today's conversation. We'll be talking about ableism. We will be talking about racism, both at times in the context of violence specifically. We'll be talking about experiences of homelessness and houselessness in some of our examples, and we'll be talking about forced institutionalization, as that unfortunately is something that's kind of goes hand in hand when we're talking about, divergent neurocognitive functioning. So let's start with this. I know that we have some content warnings, and of course, if anybody needs to give themselves what they need in moments where that content comes up, that's perfectly fine. I want to just get a gauge from the group we have here. If anybody knows what neurodiversity is, maybe you've heard the phrase before, and even if you haven't heard the phrase before, if you want to sort of take a guess of what that might mean, if you look at the sort of etymology of the phrase neurodiversity, what do we think that might mean? If anybody wants to be brave and take a crack at it, with the spirit of course, of daring to be wrong, because I will dare to be wrong often.
Is it a fancy way of saying we think differently?
Yeah, kind of. I think that's spot on for sure. I'm seeing the chat similar, different ways of thinking, like neurospicy or neurospecificity. Yeah, absolutely. So that's absolutely a part of what neurodiversity is, right? The sort of variation in our neurocognitive functioning, the variation of the way brains work. Anyone else want to add to that? Because I think that's a real good start. And if not, that's fine. So the way I might phrase it, because I think this is a really important first part of what we're going to be talking about today, is indeed divergence from the neurotypical model of brain functioning. Absolutely. And for those who may be unfamiliar, neurotypical in this sort of literature often refers to people whose brains often work similarly to the way the homogeny does, similarly to the way that is considered, typical. Folks who are often categorized outside of that homogeny, that might be neurodivergent people, like myself, for example. I am autistic, I am neurodivergent. So the first part of neurodiversity here that I'm talking about is the natural variation of neurocognitive function in our species. The fact that each of our neurologies are infinitely different and can serve as a key facet of our identity. And I think this infinitely different is a really important part. Very often, either explicitly or implicitly, oftentimes medical structures and social service structures think about disability from the perspective that there is some sort of normal or typical or healthy brain that you start from. And then the brains that sort of diverge from that or cause divergent behaviors or experiences are then placed in these categories that we label as autistic or ADHD or schizophrenic or bipolar. And what neurodiversity is first proposing is that this shouldn't be framed as a defect that we need to fix and solve. That shouldn't be our sort of initial impulse. That our initial impulse is that is a part of human diversity, that not only are our brains different, it's infinitely different, and that each one of our brains is going to function very, very differently, and that is okay. And in fact, it's beyond okay. It can actually serve as something that we identify with. That's something that can shape the way that we experience and view the world. And so this kind of part of neurodiversity is something that I think is really starting to gain some traction. We're starting to see neurodiversity be codified in a lot of more mainstream medical structures. But I do want to add something to it, because I think there's something that's really important to neurodiversity as a movement that I wouldn't want to get left behind. And that's the idea that a normal or healthy brain is a culturally constructed concept. And this is really important that we're going to talk about moving forward in this presentation, is the idea that it's not just a sort of vague, neurodiversity isn't a vague wash of some brains are different than the normal brain, and that's okay, though that's also true. But it's the idea that the normal brain doesn't exist in and of itself. It's not a biological thing. The normal brain is something that is built by social structures, it's built by power structures, and we're going to take a look at some examples over the course of this conversation of ways in which those social structures police different kind of brains and police different kind of neurocognitive functionings in order to enforce that idea of a normal brain. So that's kind of the overview of what we're going to be looking at today. And I want to stress that this isn't just a sort of tool for us to use this in our sort of toolbook, our tool set, where we take it out and this is a neurodivergent intervention. This is what's called a paradigm shift, right? It goes a little bit beyond just a tool we use. It is a shift in the way of thinking about disability, more generally speaking. Does anyone know, can someone tell me, because I don't want to assume knowledge here. What is a paradigm? What does that mean when I say that? Does anybody have any thoughts about what that might be?
Sort of a perspective or a way of seeing the world.
Yeah, I love that. It's a perspective or a way of seeing the world. I think that's great. And usually it's something that's not just a little way of seeing the world. It's kind of a big picture way of seeing the world. So a very common example for what a paradigm is, actually, this author that I'm citing on the screen here, Nick Walker, she cites, for example, before Galileo, there was the assumption that the sun revolved around the earth. And then suddenly, oh, actually, the earth revolves around the sun. That is a paradigm shift. That fundamentally changes the way that we operate. It fundamentally changes the way that we understand the world around us. And I want us to think about neurodiversity similarly, because it is in contrast to a different paradigm, and that is the pathology paradigm. So this is sort of a more common that we see in mainstream medical structures, way of thinking about disability and a neurocognitive difference. We oftentimes pathologize it. What does pathologize mean? Can someone help me out? Because there might be some who maybe isn't familiar with that sort of terminology.
Or diagnosing things?
Yeah, for sure. It's diagnosing things. Yeah, it's categorizing them for sure. It is to regard or treat someone or something as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy, right? And so the pathology paradigm's first impulse, or our impulse, is under a pathology paradigm is to look at abnormal behavior and then to categorize it as a problem that needs to be solved. It frames disability as a problem that exists in and of itself, right? And what neurodiversity is trying to say and do is that the disability itself, or the difference in cognitive functioning, or isn't the problem. It is when that neurocognitive functioning meets with a social structure that does not account for neurocognitive difference, that is not accessible, that's where the problem actually lies. Because there are some real consequences to framing disability as something that is a problem that exists by itself biologically. It can lead to things like internalized ableism and masking. So internalized ableism, what I mean by that is, so ableism, as some of us might know, that is when there are biases around assuming that that an able body or an able mind is better than a disabled body or mind. And when policy or cultural stigma impact those disabled folk, that is ableism. Internalized ableism is when disabled folk in turn start to believe those ableist frameworks and believe that themselves to be broken, they believe themselves to be deficient, and that they are in need of being fixed, right? And a pathology paradigm, because it's so pervasive, right? Because the categories of like autism, for example, we first encounter them through things like a DSM, right? That sort of like lists these problems that need to be solved, right? Or even the puzzle piece, which is this sort of very pervasive iconography in autism, where the puzzle piece implies that there's something to be fixed, right? And the problem with internalized ableism is it can lead to something called masking. So masking is when disabled folk tend to act or behave in a way that is counter to their natural impulses. They're often counter to the things that bring them joy, so that they can pass as neurotypical. They can pass as someone who is not disabled, and are often rewarded for doing so. They might do this out of a sense of self-shame, for example, or they might do it because they know that they will be punished if they don't do it. So for a common example, you know, when I was in grade school, right, I am often a fidgeter. That's part of my autistic sort of tendencies. I play with toys, I fidget, I can't stand still, etc. And teachers often, you know, frame this as a disruptive thing, right? As opposed to finding ways to figure out what I was needing in that moment, right? And framing something that was bringing me joy as an autistic person, it was framed as a problem to be solved. It was a problem for every other kid in that class, right? And in that moment, I was taught that I need to mask, right? That my preferences of that bring me joy aren't as important as the comfortability of the abled people around me. What are some other examples of the ways that we might culturally punish neurodivergent behavior or disabled behavior? Anyone have any thoughts?
From a more educational standpoint, it's often they're placed into a isolated classroom, not as generalized in education, and they lose a lot of social aspects of development in that.
Sure, absolutely. I think it's a great example, 100%. What else? What else are some of the ways that we culturally might punish neurodivergent behavior?
I think some people might call someone weird or kind of make them shrink into themselves. I'm loud and I know I'm loud. And so when someone points that out, it kind of, you know, I get embarrassed and I kind of shrink into myself. So I'm masking. But you're kind of taking away those shiny parts of their personality and kind of dulling them.
I love that. And I think it's a great example. And those are kind of two good dual examples, because one is like a structural institutional punishment, and one is a little bit more of a like social, you know, punishment, right? It's more a social ostracization based on stigma, right? And both those things are really important, I think, to consider when we're thinking about the pathology paradigm. Because when we're thinking about a paradigm, it's not just this intervention is or isn't ableist. It's thinking about how do we as a culture think about disability, and how does that impact every interaction we might have, or even impact the language and linguistics we use around disability and what they may imply. So I'm really encouraging us when we're thinking from a neurodiversity perspective to get really critical about investigating the little things, right? Investigating where are these moments where we might hold ableist assumptions about disability. For example, if I can move this slide, there we go. I'm going to talk about why I prefer identity first language to person first language. So I might venture to guess that in a room full of people who are practitioners, who work in the field of disability, some training you may have had at some point may have encouraged you that person first language should be sort of like the default way to refer to disability, that it is the sort of polite thing to do. And to be clear, some disabled folk want person first language for sure. I don't want to say like in person first language is bad and you should never use it. But what I will say from my experiences, I do not prefer person first language. I prefer what's called identity first language. I don't want to be referred to as somebody with autism. I want to be referred to as an autistic person. And before I go into sort of the nuances of why I feel that way, I do want to qualify though that like some of these questions of disability linguistics can get tricky and nuanced. When in doubt, just ask the person you're interacting with if they have a preference. They may not, but when in doubt, it's always just nice to ask if they do have a preference. I want to start with this quote from one of my favorite autistic authors, Jim Sinclair, in a piece that's a big seminal piece for disability studies and autism studies called Don't Mourn for Us. Jim notes, it is not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with. What do we read into that quote? What is Jim saying? Any ideas?
Well, the person is a whole, so that's a part of who they are. So it's like the puzzle piece. If you take out one piece of puzzle, boom, you got a busted puzzle. And it doesn't look the same.
Sure. And I think that's a very common way to think of autism, is the idea of like, it's a part of them. But I think what Jim is saying here to some degree is it's going to challenge that notion a little bit. Insofar as that's a core, yeah, I see someone in the chat, that's a core part of identity. Yeah, and I think the core is a really good word, because I think what Jim is saying here is there's an idea, by framing disability as like, here's the person and here's the autism, and the autism is like a part of that person. Well, no, it is. It's an intrinsic part of them. And in fact, what he's saying to some degree is it's a pervasive part of him. That if you were to remove the autistic part of Jim, that you wouldn't be left with the same Jim. That Jim wouldn't exist, right? And that by implying that autism is like a shell or a piece that hides an otherwise normal person.
This is Beverly.
Oh, yes, Beverly.
Is the resident here? All right.
I'm sorry, I don't think I quite understood your question. I'm sorry, Beverly.
I think she might have been off mute, Cortland.
Excellent. We'll keep it rolling then. So I think what Jim is saying to some degree here is that to imply that, because for person first language, I think in a very well-meaning way, attempts to separate the person from the disability, right? It attempts to sort of foreground the personhood as opposed to the disability as a way to, as a nicety, right? What Jim is saying, and what I think a lot of people who operate from a neurodiversity perspective, including myself, think is, why should it be polite to make personhood antithetical to disability, right? And to imply that it is nice or polite to not look at the disability or to not talk about the disability is to imply that there's something wrong with it. And it becomes more clear when you think about the language that we use in other facets of identity, right? Because we don't use person first language in other parts of identity. I don't describe myself as a person with whiteness or a person with maleness, for example, right? I am white, I am male-ish. I'm queer, right? I don't say I'm a person with queerness. That sort of invokes this icky 90s search for a gay gene, right? But what we do use person first language is something either mundane, like I'm a person with a blue shirt, or something that's bad, like a person with cancer, right? And so the reason I bring this up is just to think critically about the way in which a pathology paradigm, and a pathology paradigm frames disability as something that is invasive. It creates a difficult framework to look at from a disability perspective. It creates a situation where you have a combative relationship with disability. But I think in a neurodiversity paradigm, disability is not invasive. It is rather pervasive. It colors every experience I have. Every touch, every sensation, every thought, every interaction I have is filtered through being autistic. And that may not every autistic person may feel that way, by the way. I don't want to leave here saying like, oh, autistic people prefer identity first language. No, not necessarily, but I do. And I think it's important to engage with the nuance and not, in the neurodiversity paradigm is asking us not to resort to catch-alls, not to resort to easy answers, right? In these regards. And so if we aren't thinking about disability as something that's invasive, if we're not thinking of disability as something that is a problem to be solved, how might neurodiversity ask us to think about disability? I would say it asks us to think about it as something that is fluid and relational. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to give you an example. So what do I have here in my hand right here, right? These are glasses. And so glasses, you know, by all means, they're assistive technology, right? Right now, because I do not have my glasses off, I can't read the names on the screen right now. Can't do it. Absolutely not. I need to put them back on, actually, or it's going to be a problem. For you to share. So by all means, there is some sort of biological limitation that I have, right? In which my body is not doing the thing that my eyes are, you know, designed to do. And yet, when we look at somebody, you know, if you're walking on the street and you see somebody who's wearing glasses, you don't clock that as a disabled body necessarily, or maybe you do, I don't know. But I think culturally, that's not something we do often. Why? Why? Because it's a bodily difference, right? From a design perspective. So what do we think? Why don't we think people with glasses are labeled as disabled? Just from the chat here, you pull up the chat. Do not want to be him. Oh, sorry, there's some good stuff in the chat from our previous conversation. I'll try to be more diligent looking at the chat here. It's common, it's so common. Yes, okay, it's common. Yeah, absolutely, right? The tool for accessibility, it's talked about normalized. Love that. The tool for accessibility is so readily available, by and large, not for everyone, but like by and large, and it's so culturally normalized that we cease to consider the thing that the glasses is modifying as disability at all, right? And so let's take it a step further. Familiarity normalizes, yeah, for sure. Let's take a step further. Let's talk about folks who use wheelchairs, for example. Now that is similarly, an accessibility tool. It's a stiff tech. And yet we look at somebody who uses a wheelchair and we do clock that culturally as a disabled body. We go, that's a disabled body. What is the difference functionally? Because, I mean, wheelchairs, we see them in culture, maybe not as frequently as glasses in our sort of like day-to-day interactions. And they're definitely a little less accessible. Ask anybody who uses a wheelchair how expensive that might be. It can be a real problem from that perspective, but it's still something that we recognize. So what is another factor? What's the difference between glasses and a wheelchair? Any ideas? Yeah, they encounter obstacles when using the thing that helps them. Yeah, Lisa, that is so good. And in fact, it's exactly what I had in mind for sure. Because if somebody who uses a wheelchair encounters a building that doesn't have a ramp, that accessibility tool, it's incomplete, right? And so when we're thinking about disability, we can't just think about the relationship between the tool and the body. It's tool, body, environment, culture, all of these things coalesce to create a conception of what is or isn't categorized as disabled. In other words, it's fluid and it's relational, right? And by fluid, I mean it's ever changing, right? In a world where glasses weren't so readily available, perhaps the need for them would be considered, disabled. And conversely, and this is perhaps a bit utopian, but I think it's worthwhile to think about, in a world where every single building has a ramp, where every single structure is accessible, perhaps that is a world where we don't even clock wheelchair use as disability, right? And that's the thing I'm trying to get across here. Neurodiversity is similarly thinking about the ways in which disability is not a static, fixed biological experience. It is in relationship to culture, to environment, to societal norms. That's what we're getting at. But both in glasses and wheelchair use, we're talking about things that have some sort of biological impetus, right? It's empirical. You know, the can't see-ness has a tangible thing that you can attach to it. But let's talk about something like schizophrenia. What makes schizophrenia different from, say, the need for wheelchair use or I can't see without my glasses? I was wondering if folks don't diss my ability. Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great word. And what I kind of even like, sorry, slight tangent to David's lovely comment there. What I even like to think about is when we think about disability, you know, what is disabling that person? Because it's often not their body or their mind. Often that building without a ramp is disabling that person, right? And so we can think about disability, not, you know, it's what is disabling them for sure. But back to the question, I can get scattered sometimes. I'll be careful with the chat here. Yeah, what makes schizophrenia different?
Schizophrenia has negative connotations behind it. There is never anyone positively depicted with schizophrenia. And oftentimes, even when you walk into a store and you see somebody that's very disheveled and hasn't taken care of themselves appropriately, automatically people move to like schizophrenia and all the scary mental illnesses that go along with it.
Yeah, that's spot on, Rebecca, for sure. There's a lot of negative connotations that come with schizophrenia, a lot of baggage culturally, for sure. And, you know, there's definitely baggage. Don't get me wrong. There's definitely can be baggage for, you know, physical disability as well, no doubt, for sure. I'm seeing some other things in the chat here. Can't see. Yeah, you can't see schizophrenia for sure. You can't mark it, no doubt. So these are all good, absolutely. Another thing I would ask, yeah, media has really shaped something into a stigma for sure. Another thing I'd add is that despite decades of scientific efforts, schizophrenia lacks an objective biological diagnostic test. It's a big difference, for sure. And why is it a big difference? Well, let me tell you. So like, I'll use autism as an example, because that's my lived experience. So when I was diagnosed as autistic, and we can get into the nuances of research that may or may not suggest that, you know, autism has a, you know, a genetic component, and that's fine. But practically, you know, practically speaking, no one did a brain scan on me. No one, you know, drew my blood and went like, aha, we found the autism. That's not what happened. What happened was that a series of cultural police, right, a teacher, a counselor, a psychiatrist, a parent even, viewed my behaviors and they determined that was abnormal, right? They determined that it wasn't something that was good. And so they've morphed it and categorized it into something called autism, right? And I think it's really important to note that, not because that's bad necessarily. Sometimes, you know, taking a look at behaviors and categorizing them have a lot of use. But what gets tricky is when we start to do a shortcut where we think that kind of categorization is objective, right? And it has science behind it. It has a lot of like academic rigor behind it, but it's not essentialized in a way a broken bone is, right? And I say this because I think there's a lot of very well-meaning folks who might liken something like schizophrenia or mental health distress to a broken bone in an attempt to destigmatize it. And again, that's a great goal. They might say, you know, well, you wouldn't be embarrassed about going to treat a broken arm. Why would you be embarrassed about going to seek mental health resources? And that's all in good, but it comes with a cost, I think, that comparison. And what that cost is that you start to lose the broader question of what these mental health categorizations are, of what these cognitive categorizations are, and that when we treat them, you know, obviously fixing a broken bone is not easy. I'm sure that's a complicated process, but it's an objective process. It's broken and then it's unbroken. But categorizing what is or is not appropriate behavior is anything but objective purely. And neurodiversity is really asking us to think critically about what are all the factors that lead to these sort of categorizations and these pathologizations? So I'm going to give you an example here from schizophrenia. So this guy right here, this is Jonathan Metzl, a lovely psychiatric researcher, and he did a fascinating study in a place called the Iona State Hospital, formerly known as the Iona State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. It is a hospital in the suburbs of Detroit. And what he did is he did a study where he took a look at patient records from it historically, because they had very good documentation of this particular hospital. And he used a combination of those patient records as well as like newspaper clippings from that time and sort of other, historical ethnographic sort of evidence of that way. And he wanted to track the way that schizophrenia was treated and conceptualized and thought of through the late 1950s through the late 1960s at this particular institution. And the findings, I think, are really revealing in terms of the fluidity of some of these cognitive and mental health diagnoses. So what were the findings? Well, what he found is that in the early and pre-1960s, that schizophrenia was a diagnosis that was predominantly given to suburban white women who were usually institutionalized for disobeying their husbands. So right off the bat, that should set off some red flags in terms of, oh, is that an appropriate reason for institutionalization? In a modern context, the symptoms that were sort of listed for this would probably be labeled as depressive rather than schizophrenic or perhaps manic depressive. But what I'm asking of us is, do we look at this because hysteria did not work anymore? Yeah, we can talk for sure, Rebecca, about the history of hysteria diagnosis, because that's its own fascinating conversation for sure. Yes, okay, diagnosis also depends on context for sure. In this case, a historical and cultural context. I love this. And I apologize if I'm not responding to your comments. There's a lot of them happening at once, so I'll just peek at them periodically. But when we're looking at this, I would maybe encourage us not to, just look up at them with our modern practitioner noses up in the air going, what fools, they thought it was schizophrenia, but really it was depressive symptoms. Because that's perhaps not the most useful framework, right? Because the point isn't that they were wrong. The point is that it's context and culturally dependent for sure. And it becomes very apparent that it's cultural and context dependent when you take a look at the mid to late 1960s, because there's a huge shift in schizophrenic diagnosis in the mid to late 1960s in Iona. You start to see, instead of predominantly suburban white women, you see Black men being diagnosed as schizophrenic. And in large part, this is because between the early 1960s and the late 1960s, the DSM-2 comes out. And as we talked about in the pathology paradigm slide here, the DSM gets to dictate a lot of the frameworks of how we look at disability. And this is where we start to see associations of schizophrenia and things like aggressive behavior and violence. And so perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that we start to see with those new symptoms added that it's predominantly Black men who are getting diagnosed. Why might that be? Anyone want to take a crack at that one? That's okay. I'll answer this. So it's racism. Yeah. When we associate violent behaviors and aggressive behaviors with Black men specifically, which is still a trope that's pervasive in 2023, we start to see it literally shifts who's getting diagnosed, right? And do we think that Black men are biologically more susceptible to schizophrenia? Probably not. It's probably that the culture of racism in Iona Hospital in the 1960s coalesces with the new diagnostic categorizations in the DSM-2. And if you aren't convinced, if you take a look at the symptoms that were given at the time, it's pretty shocking. You see things like paranoid against the police and conversion to Islam, right? And if you were a Black man in the 1960s, if you're a Black man in 2023, hey, being afraid against the police perhaps shouldn't be a pathologized paranoia. And yet here they are, institutionalized forcibly most of the time into this institution. And this is a very clear historical example, perhaps even a very blunt historical example of the ways in which culture and politics and coalesces with these pathologizations, and it shapes how we think about them. And neurodiversity is really encouraging us to be critical of these diagnoses. It's not critical always in the like, this is wrong and always unuseful, but critical in terms of like having a critical eye, thinking really strong about why are these things being pathologized? Why are these things being labeled as something that is undesirable? And a lot of the time you will find that there is a lot of political residue, you know, that gets embedded in these sort of things. And while it might be easy to sort of look back at these 1960s diagnoses and go, oh, how dare racism invade the sanctity of medical science? What I would maybe encourage us to think about is there's probably a fair amount of racism involved in current medical science, especially if you look at, you know, questions of health disparity. And the data is very clear about that. That is very clear about, you know, problems with racism and health disparities. And that comes here. And in fact, Black men are still diagnosed with schizophrenia at disproportionately high rates. It's to this day. So that's a past example. Yes, especially in relation to detention is a very good point for sure. No doubt. Absolutely. Especially because and then to that point, it's even because it's pathologizing can become a very useful tool for the state to use, right? To complete political objectives and agendas in this regard. We see that, for example, in the past's pathologization of queerness, for example. It was not that long ago that being homosexual was a pathologized state, you know, for sure. That was not, you know, ages and ages and ages ago. And in fact, many people who try to wield transphobic rhetoric often still resort to a pathologizing framework. They'll talk about it as a mental illness. They'll conflate it with mental illness. It happens all the time. That's not coincidental. It's by design, you know? And in fact, it's perhaps worth noting that, and I did not necessarily intend to go deep into this, so you can do the research yourselves, but the person who pioneered ABA in this country was also the pioneer in part to queer conversion therapy in this country. And I don't think that's a coincidence, right? Both are designed to take a look at behaviors that are considered culturally abnormal and to, you know, Pavlovianly beat it out of them. Even if it actually doesn't change their interiority, it changes their behavior, and that's all it cares about, right? So even if a queer person comes out of gay conversion therapy saying, hey, I don't, you know, I'm actually still queer, but I've learned to behave more straight. Similarly, a lot of autistic advocates, including myself, would argue that ABA does very little to change the interiority of autistic folks. It just teaches us to be very afraid of acting non-autistic. Which that's a whole deeper conversation, but it's something that I think demonstrates the point. But let's use a modern example as well. Ooh, we're running low on time. Apologies. I'll try to run through this pretty quick here. Let's talk about pathology as culture policing in a modern context, because I don't want to just look at historical examples. Let's take a look at New York City's recent plan with Mayor Eric Adams and their plan to solve the homelessness crisis. So he has done a pretty hard shift to take a look at the homelessness crisis. In particular, there's a lot of plans to not just send police to break up, you know, homelessness camps, but sending, you know, teams of mental health practitioners and social workers. And on the surface, this seems like a very good plan, because I think we might all agree that, you know, better access to mental health services is probably net good for populations that are experiencing distress through to lack of housing. But there are some other considerations to consider when you start to scratch the surface of it. So let's start with this. If somebody engages in a forced hospitalization of someone, what's usually the criteria that leads to that hospitalization? Any ideas from the team? What's the usual sort of like tagline? Yeah, danger to self or others. Absolutely. Risk to self or others. That's the very common one. Absolutely. I'm seeing it all over. The person's not safe to risk themselves or others. But and this is directly from the Eric Adams press release, according to the OMH, that's the Office of Mental Health memorandum, both in sections 9.41 and 9.58, authorized to remove a person who appears to be mentally ill and displays an inability to meet basic living needs, even when no recent dangerous act has been observed, right? Yeah, appears is a very key word for sure. So what this implies is that if a police officer sees fit, they can go in with a team of social workers to the subway for somebody who is living down there, frankly, because it's probably cold in the winter upstairs and they're trying to get heat, and they can force them into an institution. They can, or to a hospital, I should say, right? In a way, even if they're not a risk to somebody. And so in this regard, pathologization is serving a sort of a very beneficial PR thing for the Eric Adams administration, because it's a lot more palatable to say, in a press release, there were 1,500, mental health interventions today, than it is to say there are 1,500 arrests today, even if it's largely functionally the same, because ultimately what happens is they get forced into a hospital for a very small period of time. All their worldly possessions are taken away, the shelters are broken up, and then they send them back out, right? And is that actually helpful for them from a mental health perspective? And I don't think it takes an expert in mental health practitioning to maybe assume that stealing someone's all worldly possessions, holding them, against their will in a very short period of time, and then just releasing them back onto the street is not a particularly useful mental health intervention. And so skip to paste. So why did he do it, right? So what does this help, right, for the Eric Adams administration? It's because his primary, campaign donor is real estate investors, ultimately, right? Yeah, it's greed, absolutely, right? It serves a political interest. And that's the thing I want us to think about, because what is being pathologized here? It's poverty, right? Being poor is a state that is pathologized. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that nobody who's experiencing homelessness is not in need of mental health resources. But what I am saying is that maybe a pathologizing framework is insufficient to solve that problem. They need houses, for example, they need a place to live. And is that a mental health disorder? Is that a cognitive impairment? Sometimes they might coalesce, but quite frankly, I would venture to guess that a vast majority of people in this room are far closer to experiencing homelessness than they are to permanent, stability. It takes one financial crisis. And I say that because I think it's really important to destigmatize that it takes some series of absurdly bad decisions to end up as someone experiencing homelessness. It can happen to anyone. But neurodiversity is making us think about, what is the pathologizing doing here, right? Now, that was a lot of sad stuff. That was a lot of negative stuff, but I want to make sure, I'm going to skip this part because I want to get to how neurodiversity can help, right? Because I know we're running low on time here. Because it doesn't have to be this way, right? We don't have to constantly be pathologizing and stuck in this muck of cultural racism and homophobia and hate of people who are experiencing poverty. We can take a look at other ways to think about disability, and then how can we as professionals create and craft spaces that validate those experiences. So let's start with this. Accessibility isn't just a question of logistics. It's about relationship building, it's about communication, it's about trust. Oftentimes, sometimes when we think about accessibility, we think about X measure means Y body can enter the space. But neurodiversity encourages a more fluid framework where it's not just about checking a bunch of boxes, it's about how do you actually engage with that person. This is very in tune with person-centered approaches, which some of you may be familiar with. Also, access need should be a guiding principle of the space rather than a collapse exercise. You have to build the space from the bottom up with these ideas in mind of access needs. And we'll go in a little bit about what an example of that might look like. Because our access tools are only as good as people feel empowered to use them. I'll give a very brief example of this. So when I was working as an accessibility consultant in the theater world, for example, one of my very early jobs, I had somebody who was autistic and they experienced sensory overload from a sound perspective, right? And what they needed was a space that they could go away when things got very loud and just be alone in silence. And I was like, easy, perfect. We built that into the rehearsal room, no problem. And yet when the time came for them to use it, because they were clearly experiencing some distress, they didn't go and use the tool. They didn't go into the silent room. And why? Because I did nothing to normalize that as a tool to use. It would have been incredibly isolating and essentially calling that person out for needing that tool. And so what I needed to do was I needed to create a situation where people were okay with expressing what they needed, what their access needs were. This is why, for example, a lot of people will do, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, access need check-ins for everyone in the space, right? So an access need check-in can be something as specific cognitively as I get sensory overload from sound, I need a silent space. But it could be as simple as I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, and I might be a little tired today, or it's really hot in this room. I might have to go into the water fountain more often than I usually would. And how much easier is it for that autistic person in the room to go and say, sometimes it gets really loud and I'm going to have to go sit in a silent space. If you've already built a culture of people asking for what they need, right? This is what neurodiversity is trying to do. It's not trying to just like fit X body into Y space. It's changing a framework, because if you're really tired that day, if we're thinking about disability as something with fluidity, maybe you're a little disabled that day. You're being disabled by something, by a lack of sleep, by a hot room. The other thing I didn't want to skip past, though, is this real quick. Know the difference, because I think this is really important. Know the difference between uncomfortable and unsafe behaviors, because there's a big difference between those two things, right? If somebody's stim, for example, is to bang their head against the wall, you got an unsafe behavior. You probably have to intervene in a different way in order to get someone's stim to stop them from banging their head against the wall. If somebody's stim is flapping their arms, which is a very common stim, maybe you don't have to address that. Maybe that is an action that gives them joy. And maybe it's not super imperative to get them to stop doing that. And so, because our goal, I think, as practitioners in many ways is to heal harm, create space, and it's not to bolster abled comfortability, right? And so knowing the difference in the techniques that we use, what is unsafe, what is uncomfortable. I'm going to speed through these because I don't want to low. Sometimes it's useful to make the space less professionalized. What are the cultural rules that we're assuming are necessary, and maybe they're not. If an autistic person has, very sensitive necks and they can't wear a tie, maybe you don't need a tie. What is actually critical? Explicitly name that behaviors like stimming, rocking, and walking around are okay. It's about validating these things that are that we usually culturally punish, but actually don't cause any harm to themselves or others. When in doubt, slow down, because this works really hard, though. Neurodiversity embraces complexity. It embraces gray space. And that's to say, like, I get it wrong a lot. And probably all of us will get it wrong a lot when we're trying to engage in neurodiversity principles in our work. And that's okay. Instead of like self-punishing and go, I got it wrong, let's speed through it. Slow down, circle back, normalize silence. This work's about conversations. It's about relationship building. It's going to take time. And finally, acknowledge access intimacy. This is a phrase coined by Mia Mingus, who's a lovely disability rights advocate. And she talks about the ways in which building accessible spaces, and don't get me wrong, like keep your professional boundaries, it's very important, but like it's more than just logistics. It's going to mean something to that disabled person, right? When somebody's access needs are met, there is an emotional component to that I think it's important for us to understand might be happening when working. Questions, though we have very little time for it. I don't know how flexible we are, but thank you for being here and let me talk about neurodiversity, because it warms my heart. It's very important to me, and I appreciate all y'all's time and listening. Any questions?
Remember to unmute yourself if you do have a question, or you can
That too. Or use the chat. I got my eye on it now. I didn't quite perfect the eye on the chat during the presentation. I'll work on it.
You did wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Nesley.
Is that someone trying to?
The offer you mentioned in access to me, yes, especially because I think I might have forgot to put them in my references, which I will amend. Yeah, so that is Mia Mingus. So Mia Mingus is great. One of my favorite writers about disability. Let me see if I can find very quickly that article specifically that I'm referencing. And let's see, because I might have a link to it. We'll find out. Ooh, yeah, here we go. She's great. Just go read everything by Mia Mingus. That's my greatest contribution that I can give. She's brilliant. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to shoot me an email, or maybe I'll put my email in the chat here. because I'm always more than willing to talk about these sort of things. They make me very happy inside, and especially because I want to learn from like y'all too, because I'm not like up here on high as some like neurodiversity expert, right? It's a process. We're all learning it for sure. So, and the more I have conversations about it, the more nuanced my understanding about these sort of things becomes for sure. So let me put that in the chat. Alrighty. Without further ado, I think that's the thing.
Okay, well, Cortland, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your knowledge about this, and we really appreciate it. This has been very helpful for many of us, and I'm thinking of many next steps. So appreciate your time in educating us today, and thanks everyone for joining us. Have a nice afternoon.
Thanks everybody. Take care.